We are privileged to talk about Vanessa Williamson's new book, The Price of Democracy, The Revolutionary Power of Taxation in American History. I've read the whole book. I've learned an enormous amount from Vanessa's writing. I encourage you to check it all out. One of my pet peeves is moderators who steal the thunder from the authors, so I will not do that. I will just tell you the book combines politics, economics, and history in a way that's very convincing, very novel, and I'm fairly certain you have never seen before. So I encourage you to read it. It will give you a perspective on taxes in American history that I think is valuable and sorely needed right now. Stepping back, Vanessa is a senior fellow in the Governance Studies program here, and she's a senior fellow at the Tax Policy Center. In my view, she is one of the most articulate and thoughtful commentators on tax policy. Generally, she writes about taxes and democracy, including tax politics and history, a very wide range of other topics. Among her many other writings, she has notably advocated for voter registration at the time of income tax filing. This is her third book, so besides her books and her academic work, her writings have appeared in the Washington Post, the New York Times, the Atlantic, and even in Teen Vogue. She earned her PhD from Harvard University. We are especially honored here to have Danny Werfel participate in a fireside chat with Vanessa. Danny has very high status in the tax community as a person who, believe it or not, has led the IRS on two distinct occasions, first in the Obama administration, then in the Biden administration. If you've heard about the Biden administration's effort to modernize the IRS, if you've heard about their record levels of customer service and compliance during the Biden administration, if you've heard about the free online tax filing system that they opened up, you have heard of Danny's work and Danny's leadership in the tax world. Today, he serves as the executive in residence at the Johns Hopkins School of Government and Public Policy, and he's a distinguished fellow at Duke's Stanford School of Public Policy. And as the college basketball season descends upon us, I cannot resist making a personal note that Danny has a degree both from Duke University and the University of North Carolina. And I imagine, as a Duke alum myself, I imagine that negotiating those dual loyalties during the basketball season might almost be as hard as running the Internal Revenue Service. So with that, please welcome Vanessa and Danny, and thank you for being here.
Thank you so much. Well, I was joking with Vanessa that when I saw her this morning, I was so excited to talk about the book, and I got here early. We talked about the book a lot, and I said, well, we're done. But I really found the book to be just a truly important, fascinating educational tool for me. And I thought, oh, I wish I would have read this before I went into the IRS, because it would connect me better to the history, but also the importance that taxes, tax policy, and tax administration play in our history, certainly in our present, but perhaps most importantly in our future. And that's why this book is so timely and so important. But I want to start, Vanessa, with this point that the book makes, which really kind of filled my soul. When I was the IRS commissioner, and even to this day, and I'm trying to describe the IRS in plain terms, I always kind of make the point, look, we're the tax collector. We're iconically unpopular. But when you start reading this book, you realize that Americans have not always hated taxes. The book overturns that myth and shows that many of our founding conflicts were not about the level of taxes, but really about taxation without representation. The Tea Party, and this was great, the Tea Party was literally a protest against a tax cut. I just think that's amazing. Talk to a little bit about like how our entire taxation is built on this myth.
Yeah, so I mean, everyone feels like they know the story of the Boston Tea Party. I mean, in part because it has been a touchstone, for conservatives in recent years during the Obama administration. But while the story you have in your mind of, Boston artisans and mechanics going down to the docks and throwing the tea into Boston Harbor, that's all true. That is exactly what happened that December night in 1773. They were opposing a corporate tax break for the East India Company. The East India Company was floundering, and it was very closely tied in with Parliament. And so Parliament was going to give this company a huge bailout. Some of that was direct money, but one of the things they did for the company was give them a special tax deal so that they could sell their tea on the cheap in the colonies. And it would undercut all of the company's competitors, right? And so Sam Adams, who led the Sons of Liberty and led this particular act of rebellion, he thought that this tax cut was introductive of monopolies, and therefore what he said was a threat to public liberty. And so the story of the Boston Tea Party is sort of seen as this touchstone about how Americans are always so mad about taxes. And in a sense, that's true. They were mad about taxes, but they were mad about the unfairness of taxes getting cut for people who are, overly closely tied to the government, right? And so it's really a very different story, much more like, maybe the folks who try and block oil pipelines or other people who've stood up to sort of corporate malfeasance. It's much more like that than the way that it's commonly remembered.
Yeah, I just think it's a great fun fact. I have it in my bag for Thanksgiving dinner. I'm definitely going to break it out. I was once asked what the role of government is, and I was really trying to think about it in as plain language as I could. And so I took the audience, when I got the question, I said, well, let's go back to the Wild West and the frontier, and let's look at what the world looked like with little or no government. And so I was really pleased that your book also went to the frontier. And we have this vision of people out in the 1800s, rugged individualists, but actually, according to your book and your research, they were violent advocates for more progressive taxation. Yeah. They were not anti-tax in the least. So talk to us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so that's true both in the early days of the frontier, when the frontier was in Pennsylvania, and it's true much later as well when the frontier is in what we imagine as the West. But there's this okay, so most people probably have some recollection of the Boston Tea Party as an event. And you may have heard the phrase Whiskey Rebellion, but I think in general the amount of knowledge you have about that is just substantially lower as a rule, right? So let me tell you about the Whiskey Rebellion. Alexander Hamilton, Treasury Secretary, was deeply committed to the idea that American industries needed to grow and consolidate. He was kind of a big business guy, not in the modern way where you want government to be smaller, but where you want government to be bigger and to be investing and to be growing industries. He wanted America to be a world power like Britain. And so one of the moves he made to help that consolidation of wealth that he thought was necessary for the new country was a tax on whiskey and other spirits. And this was set up as a tax. There were huge tax breaks if you were a big distiller, and a lot of ways you were going to get dinged for extra money if you had a small family distillery. And this really made frontiersmen angry, not only because they liked to drink whiskey, which they certainly did, but also because whiskey was the only way that they could transport their grain to market. It was too far otherwise. A lot of grain becomes a little whiskey, and you can put that on a wagon. If you try and move all that grain across the Alleghenies, you're not going to get it there. And so this was completely undercutting the capacity of these farmers to get the profits they needed to buy, basic things like farm goods, and machinery. So at the same time, they're not taxing land, right? They're not putting a tax on land. And at the time, one of the things small farmers on the frontier hated was speculators who would come in and buy up all the land. This is probably a little bit equivalent to if you think about nowadays that private equity buys a lot of houses, and then people can't buy a starter home. It was very much that same dynamic. You're like, but there's nothing on the market for me if these big speculators are sitting on these huge tracts of land that they're not farming. And so there's this crazy moment. So of course, these are frontiersmen. They are, they have their muskets. Many of them have fought in the Revolution. And so when they're mad about something, they tend to do things like cut down trees and block roads and go and consider tarring and feathering someone. It was a very, very violent time. And so at one point, the militia assembles in western Pennsylvania and is going to go to the tax collector's house because he is personally a big distiller of whiskey, and he's going to impose this whiskey tax, and he doesn't have to pay for any of his land. So they're going to go and threaten him, right? They've got their muskets, and they're sort of marching in sort of loose formation. And on the dusty road on the way to this tax collector's house where they're going to shout at him about the tax system, they stop because one of their members has raised an objection. And so the way that democracy worked back then is kind of crazy because we're talking about an army marching down a road, and someone raised an objection to the secretary, so they stopped and deliberated right there on the road. And his concern was that the letter they were going to give to the tax collector didn't make it clear that they were willing to pay taxes. So they had to stop and rewrite the letter to make it clear they were absolutely willing to pay a proportionate share, that was what they said, of the taxes. They just didn't think it was fair that they, as poor people, should be paying a larger share than richer people. And so they stopped on the road and debated and rewrote the letter, and then they got back on the road with their guns and marched to the tax collector's house and began the Whiskey Rebellion. But it's sort of an amazing, for them, that was what they thought. That was all the things they were doing were part of being a new citizen, right? The stopping and debating, and also the training they had received in the Revolutionary War. They were going to stand up against oligarchs or against oppression, whether that was local or coming all the way from Britain. So yes, so these guys, so the frontiersmen are often remembered as like, I stand on my own 2 feet, I built my own log cabin with my own hands and so forth. Yes, but at the same time, they were also saying, it is not fair for the tax breaks to be going to the guy who's going to push me out of my farm, right? What we want is not no taxes. What we want is fair taxes, and that means higher taxes on the people who are getting ahead.
Yeah, so I really think it's important for us to understand how Americans feel about taxes, how they have felt through our history, so it can guide tax policy today into the future. And so one thing that I took away from the book that is clear and thematic is that when we were building our nation, there was an appetite for taxes as long as they were fair, and there was an appetite for government as long as it was meaningful to them. So for example, one of my favorite parts of the book is we're out west. It's the early frontier days, and the post office and the army are the first forms of government to get out there. And the frontiers people are like, this is good stuff. They're doing things that are improving our life. We want more. And so when you're building towards that, you're willing to, not only willing, you want to pay taxes because you want that benefit of that type of structure to your society. The next point in the book I want to get to, where there's also kind of an appetite for taxes, and this is not me arguing for more taxes, it's trying to understand how Americans think about taxes, is when we go to war. And in particular, I'm going to jump ahead to World War II. And you tell the story of how Irving Berlin wrote a song. And I'm not going to sing it. But in the chorus is a happy jingle, I paid my income tax today, and a lot of rhymes and fun with that. And it was about patriotism. And then I'll raise a third point around civic engagement. And there is kind of a connection when you pay your taxes to the sense that now you, as a taxpayer, will have a bigger voice, whether local or nationally. So these are kind of the things that inspire not a anti-tax sense, but a sense of paying taxes makes sense for the world we're living in.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, so if you think about the populists and the progressives in the West, they looked at the post office, just as you said, and they wanted to expand government like the post office to end poverty. That was their platform, right? That the government should be expanded like the post office so that it was in every town. And that meant paying taxes. And that wasn't something they object to. In fact, the populists and the progressives were essential to overturning the Supreme Court decision that had made the income tax unconstitutional. We had an income tax during the Civil War, and then in the sort of Gilded Age, there's a very rightward shift of the Supreme Court, and they say that you can't have an income tax. Well, why do we have an income tax today? Because there was a state-by-state campaign by farmers and progressives in the cities to say, hey, putting everything on a tariff is really harmful for consumers. And it means that a lot of money is getting transferred to a few very rich people in the Northeast. And the income tax was understood as this way that it would make the tax code fairer, and it could also pay for those big investments in the West that they needed, right? They needed roads, and they needed schools, and they needed all these infrastructure, to be put in place so that they could build their homes. And so, yeah, there's this huge pro-tax movement all across the West. The income tax amendment passes by unanimous consent in any number of Western states. There's no votes against it because they're so interested in this idea of building the government up. And then World War II I would love your thoughts about this very specific thing. So the income tax at first is a class tax. It's only for some very, very rich people. World War II, we got to fund a war, right? And FDR is thinking about what to do. Maybe we're going to do a national sales tax. We didn't do that. We instead extended the income tax down the income spectrum to regular people who are now going to have to pay income taxes.
Yeah.
And there's no calculators, and they've never paid the federal government taxes directly before. And so there's this mass campaign to tell people, the government is going to have to tell people how to pay and how to fill out this form. And so Irving Berlin writes this very genuinely catchy little song. It's very cute, actually. He tells people, that you pay to Uncle Sam, right? And it's going to help bring our boys home from the war and all these things. And they're Donald Duck cartoons. Disney was in crisis and was basically a solely owned subsidiary of the Air Force during World War II. But one of the films they make is about how to pay your income taxes. It has a little animated pen and Donald Duck learning about how he's going to help his boy. Because at first they're like, "Do you want to do something to help the war effort?" And Donald Duck's like, in his voice, like, "Yes, sir." And he's comes back and he's got boxing gloves on and a pot on his head, and they're like, "Pay your income taxes," and he's like. And he comes back with an abacus and a law books and a T-square and a globe. I don't know what he thinks he needs to do is pay his taxes. But then they think, no, it's very easy. And then they show the 1040, which looks kind of like it still does, honestly. And they're like, you fill out your name here, and it takes you all through it. And but they didn't know it was going to work. And so I can't can you imagine if you were in that position, you're like, okay, well, for the first time, millions of people are going to pay income taxes.
Amazing.
Is it going to happen?
Yeah.
Is it going to happen?
Well, you need a ground game.
Yeah. They had billboards, exactly. You got to be out there.
Yeah.
But they didn't know. And
it's just to draw it to something today, when I was commissioner very recently, I was super worried about online tax scams, and they're burgeoning, and they're on social media, and more people, especially post-COVID, when a lot more moved to online, there's much more risks. And I realized while I was at the IRS, to stop this, you need a ground game. It's advertising, it's understanding, it's civics education. It's not just some regulation we can write out or some budget line item. It has to be a full court press.
Yeah. And I think that's what you were beginning with direct file. It was another thing where people have to know. It's not that they can't do the thing they want to do, which in World War II was certainly to pay their income tax. It was an extremely patriotic act to do. If they don't know how, right? And so a couple days before the taxes are due, George Gallup, of the Gallup polling, calls the Treasury Secretary and says, I really think you need to get out there with all the guns because I'm not sure, people are confused. They think they can buy war bonds instead of paying the tax. And they were like, oh, really? And so they just flood the zone with the songs and the billboards and everything else. And you know what? It worked. Taxes came in. Americans paid their taxes, and they were proud to pay them. They thought their taxes were fair the first time, when they paid their income taxes. And it was just overwhelming support. In fact, one of the sort of funny side notes is because there were these songs about how you were paying Uncle Sam, some of the checks were written to Uncle Sam. Yeah. And some people who didn't have to pay brought checks anyway and asked if they could contribute, right? Because they understood that there was a big job we had to do together, and they were willing to chip in.
I want to pull a thread on, you mentioned tariffs, and there is this amazing history that's so relevant today, where this push that the Supreme Court rules that there's that an income tax is unconstitutional, And so then the 16th Amendment becomes an initiative to pass to have an income tax. And as you said, there's this kind of thread in the narrative that the tax of the day was tariffs, and that tariffs were super unpopular, and an income tax was seen as a much better approach to fairly equitably raise money in a way that protected Americans as consumers. And then you come to today, and you have the current administration or the president joking we should no longer have an internal revenue service, we should have an external revenue service. So you kind of come full circle. And so I think it's important, again, as we educate Americans about, we've been there before, and before we go back, we need to understand what we experienced the last time we went there. We have an internal revenue service and not an external revenue service, not because we just thought of it one day, because we evolved through learning and growing as a nation.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, I got to tell you, there are various things that about, in writing the book, it did prepare me for the contemporary moment in quite a lot of ways. But one that I did not foresee when I was writing the book, because over 7 years now, I did not think the tariffs chapter was going to be relevant. I thought, I was like, well, you got to write it. It was how we funded the government. You can't not write the tariffs chapter. And then this year, man, okay.
Then when I got to tariffs, I was like, ooh, it's getting good now. That was my thought.
So the tariffs, obviously the tariffs today are very different, because back then it was a very stable, very high tariff regime. And obviously the global economy was totally different. You could do tariffs in a way that you absolutely cannot do them today. And now they're very erratic, right? They're sort of constantly changing, and who knows what they're going to be. But the thing that's interesting, I think, and relevant to the contemporary moment is that people figured out very quickly that tariffs were costing them a lot, that they were making the cost of living go up really substantially. And that's why, one of the reasons why the income tax is so popular in the West is because it made buying machinery more expensive, right? Because there were all these it's an amazingly effective tool for consolidating wealth, the tariffs. It moved 8% of GDP, it's estimated, to the industrial Northeast, and specifically to the owners of a few companies that had 90% market share or more. And so one of the things that I think does relate today is you might ask yourself, okay, Americans 5 years ago had never heard of tariffs. Are they going to figure out what this means economically? And I think the evidence is that they probably can. Like people are capable of being mobilized even around an issue that seems as sort of abstract and far away as tariffs. But yeah, no, it was a critical part of the campaign for an income tax, was the recognition that you could lower the costs for poor farmers by shifting some of the cost of government onto the people who were really benefiting from the tariff regime.
Yeah. Well, personal story, I was just in Durham, my AirPods broke. I need my AirPods, so I went to go buy new ones, and oh my God, they're way more expensive. So I don't know if it's tariffs or just Apple raised their prices, but it was like, that's the type of thing where, I do think we need to educate people so they understand what they're seeing in the stores and in the supermarket, and the drivers of inflation.
Yeah.
It's important to have good evidence out there in a way that's understandable. What are the impacts of tariffs so that we can make smart decisions? Like, I think we made a smart decision to ratify the 16th Amendment way back when. I want to talk, I can't help, just because of the jobs that I've had, the IRS sections were my favorite. And I want to read back a line from your book that I loved about the first IRS Commissioner, George Boutwell. This is in the Lincoln presidency. And again, we're at that point where we need money. For the Union Army needs money, so we're going to now establish a revenue collector nationally to gather money for the war. And you say about Commissioner Boutwell, Boutwell, a rather dry little man with famously boring speeches, no great charisma, but integrity and organizational capacity made him a superb choice to run the tax authority. And I have to say, when I read that, I feel seen. That is me. That is me in a nutshell. So the legacy continues from the first commissioner to the 50th commissioner. I also, what's really interesting, and when you're a champion for the IRS, as I am, and a champion for its budget, which I am, you always talk about the return on investment, that when you add people or resources to the IRS, it pays back. And the CBO, the Congressional Budget Office, and others have, they change it every once in a while, but it's somewhere between $4 to $6 in more savings for the Treasury for every dollar spent on IRS personnel. Okay, there were 4,000, at some point, the IRS, early days, reached about 4,000 people, and they collected $39 million. So I went back to that year and I tried to figure out what the average IRS employee made back then, and I couldn't find it. But the best I could find was a government official in that era made $200 a year. So that is a total budget for the IRS personnel of $800,000, collecting $39 million. So early on, really, really high ROI. But I think what really, really hit me was in your discussion of the Civil War. You make this point that that one of the leaders of the Confederacy, in describing why they lost, was they raised more money. We couldn't keep up with the tax. The taxes won the war. So talk about that.
Yeah. So Boutwell is an amazing character. I got to tell you just for a moment. So he writes this very long autobiography, and he lived through some of, and participated in and was on the right side of history again and again and again. He was IRS Commissioner, he was Secretary of the Treasury. His capacity to organize a basically new Bureau of Internal Revenue. He said he had looked at what they had tried to do during the War of 1812, and it wasn't very helpful. So he had to invent this from scratch. He goes on to help write the 14th Amendment. He is one of the leaders of the impeachment effort of Andrew Johnson. He eventually, at the end of his life, he leaves the Republican Party because he opposes imperialism. I mean, he defends black suffrage early, and he defends black civil rights much later than all of his peers throughout his life. And so, I mean, he's just a genuinely wonderful human being. He is also the most profoundly boring man. There's this point in his autobiography. So the Treasury office had the fastest telegraph line. So Abraham Lincoln would sit there and wait for news of the war, right? And I think this is actually in the Lincoln movie. You can see him sitting in the telegraph office, in the Treasury Department. And he would come there and sit. And Boutwell happened to be walking in when Lincoln received news of Antietam. And let me tell you, I have no idea what happened then, because Boutwell's story is the most boring thing imaginable. He manages to make this incredibly crucial moment of American history just something that I think he was really focused on the telegraph machine itself. It was not the most compelling. But anyway, so this amazing person achieved something that there couldn't be enough gratitude for the winning of the Civil War, right? So the Confederate generals said afterwards that they hadn't been beaten on the battlefield, they'd been whipped in the Treasury Department. Because where the Union was strong enough to convince regular people across the North to pay these new taxes, including rich people across the North to pay these new taxes, the Southern slaveholder class did not want to be taxed. And they saw that as an imposition on their masterness. And so they couldn't admit that the government had any power over them. They were like little oligarchs, little aristocrats. And so the Confederacy couldn't, even though it was very rich, it could not raise money. And so the capacity, the boring, the attention to the machines and the baskets for all the forms and all the things that Boutwell talks about at inordinate length in his autobiography, that got the war won in a really important way. Yeah.
I want to open it up to the audience, but I want to ask a summary question for you, which really, I think, if I had to pick one question to really capture the whole book, it would be this. Is that your book and the history you lay out of taxation shows that America wasn't born anti-tax. We became anti-tax. Mm-hmm. Talk to us about that shift, and then we'll open it up to questions.
Yeah, I mean, sort of throughout American history, there have been people who were opposed to taxation. I already mentioned that slave owners were very concerned not to pay taxes. That's why all the tax limitations in our federal constitution today were sought by the slaveholding South, specifically to prevent abolition by taxation. It was a thing they were terrified of. And so there are anti-tax movements. You see an anti-tax movement again at the end of Reconstruction, a part of the Redeemer movement that overthrew the multiracial democracies of the American South. They organized themselves as taxpayers because they found that it sold better with the Northern industrialists, and also because if they said really directly that they didn't accept the end of the war, that looked like treason. But there are anti-tax movements, but it's not the view of sort of average Americans on a daily basis. It's not the view of most people. And I think that we really do live in an unusual time in the extent to which anti-tax rhetoric has really been baked into everything, so that things like the history of the Boston Tea Party come as a surprise, so that the idea that in World War II people paid taxes and were proud to have done so is sort of a lost history. And I don't think you can really talk about that without talking about two trends, right? One, the long reaction to the civil rights movement and the sort of anti-government rhetoric that came from our second effort to build a multiracial democracy. And two, the consolidation of wealth that results in significant part because we rolled back our top tax rates. And I think that the reaction and the unwillingness to accept the full scope of the American public as our polity, and the ever-increasing wealth of such a small number of people has really torn our social fabric in a way that damages our capacity to raise money, and it damages our capacity to see the government as our government. And I think it's the big challenge of our time. Like, can we refine the kind of rhetoric that was completely commonplace in the populist and progressive era to talk about the government as our government? We pay taxes because the state is a part of us, is what one progressive economist said. And he said not just that the state is part of us, but it is commonly agreed that we pay taxes not because we receive benefits, but because the state is part of us. And so this idea that it was our democracy, and it was worth it to be a part of that, and to pay your share, and that this was a project worth doing together, is something that you just don't hear enough anymore.
Yeah, it hit me in so many different ways that understanding the journey of a nation built on an acceptance of taxes, but a demand for equity in taxes has led to a space today where it's iconically part of our nation's culture that taxes are bad, and I think we have to reset and learn from this history, because, as I said earlier, and what I learned from your book, and I had never thought about it this way, that when we were building a nation, we were enthusiastic about taxes and focused on the equity of them. Mm-hmm. And now we still have more to build and more to do. And so we have to think about how to get back to a spot where we can have healthier debates about tax policy. Let me see if there's anyone in the audience.
Hi, first, congratulations, and thank you both for being here. As someone who spent almost 20 years at the IRS, I love myself a good tax book, so I'm very excited. I have not read it yet, I just bought it. So I kind of wanted to talk a little bit about the last point you made, and the role of the government moving forward in trying to fix what I do think is a problem in terms of connectivity between taxes and what their everyday life. I was walking out of our building once, which says, tax, IRS right on the side, going to lunch, and there was a family of tourists walking by, two small kids, like 5 and 8. And as I walked by, one of the parents said, "Put your hands on your pockets." So the kids do that because the IRS is going to take your money. And I walked away thinking, if children are hearing this from that tender age, then it's ingrained in them early. Now, my daughter is either lucky or maybe she'd say unlucky, because she very well knows the importance of paying taxes, so much so that when she hears on the radio, is the IRS coming after you? Are you scared of the IRS? You all know those ads. She's like, "Mom, you only go back after the people who are big cheaters." And anyway, I think, right now we're in an interesting place in the government, but there's a lot of us who are working on how we can be even better than we were before in the future. And I'd love your thoughts on the role of the government, getting back to your Donald Duck and all that, and Irving Berlin, in the future, and helping to, better civically educate from very early on what taxes do for you, rather than what the government's just taking from you.
Yeah, it's a point I talk about at the very beginning of the book, is that if you look at an introductory economic textbook, a standard one, the ones that are commonly used, they'll talk about taxes as costly to people because the government takes money away. As if they just go and throw it in the ocean after that or something, as if it doesn't, as if the people who paid the taxes weren't also riding on public roads to go to the store, or working as school teachers or firefighters, or any of the millions of ways that taxes return into the economy and actually boost the economy, right? And so, I think there's absolutely, there's been a real failure in our most basic explanations that we provide to young children, to all throughout the educational process, about what government is for, what government does. And in erasing those things, they've really erased a really important part about what citizenship is. And I think that's an extremely toxic and damaging circumstance. Danny, I would love you to talk a little bit about what you're working on, if that's okay.
Yeah.
Do you mind me putting you on the spot?
No, not at all. I mean, look, when I left the IRS in January and became a civilian again, I started getting a lot of questions from all walks of life to help use my government expertise to explain what was going on with the second Trump administration and DOGE. A lot of it related to the IRS sharing data with for immigration enforcement, or threatening Harvard's tax-exempt status, or whatever the issue of the moment was. And I spent many years at the Office of Management and Budget as well, and so there's a lot of expertise that I have in my back pocket on fraud and error and what it all means. And in talking to everyone, I realized, wow, America really needs a civics lesson, like just at every level, whether it was a member of Congress calling me, or a litigator, or an undergraduate student working on a research paper. I just, in talking to folks, I realized there's a lot to learn. And so I set out to figure out how I could advance civics literacy. And one of my projects at Duke University, actually, where I'm a fellow, got together with some students, and we started to brainstorm what could we do. And where we landed was, let's figure out maybe we can write a different type of textbook for middle school students that introduces the role of government in a way that will sing to them in this moment in 2025 and beyond. And so we're looking at how do we disrupt and be innovative. And even if it doesn't work, I hope someone will say, what else should we do? Well, Werfel tried that didn't work. But and that's okay, but let's make a foray into civics education. I think civics needs to make a comeback to teach people what you lose when you divest in government. It is, people need to be reminded that the trash needs to be picked up on Thursday, and the planes shouldn't crash into each other, and the food we eat needs to be safe from foodborne illnesses, and the potholes need to be refilled. And unfortunately, we're at a point where we have to remind Americans at every age that doesn't come free. It's important, and if we divest in government, we risk sliding backwards.
Yeah.
So.
I mean, I think one of the sort of spaces for real hope, because I think this is like such an important project, one of the spaces for real hope is that even though our political rhetoric has swung very far away from talking about the ways in which government is good, there is a basis that hasn't been eroded yet in terms of Americans' willingness to pay taxes. So, for example, most Americans think paying your taxes is a patriotic responsibility. If you ask them, is it your civic duty for every American to pay their fair share of taxes, 90+% of Americans say yes, it is. That is as much consensus as Americans are capable of, I think, fundamentally. Like, I actually, at one point, I looked at this, what questions get more than 90% agreement? And you have to ask, is like Elvis dead? Or, like, did we land on the moon? These kinds of questions. It's not that everyone agrees. They don't, but very close. And similar fractions, right? So, I mean, I think that there's and if you ask people what they're upset about with taxation, it's not different from the farmers in Western Pennsylvania or the people on the docks at Boston Harbor. They're still mad. The number one thing they're mad about is wealthy people and corporations not paying their share, right? So, it's one of the reasons why investments in the IRS were so important, is because people are willing to chip in when they feel like they're not being the one who's being a chump, right? That, like, they're not the only ones chipping in. Everyone's chipping in, and that's part of what making the system fair is about. But, there's a basis to work from here, right? Even if our sort of political rhetoric has really lost the plot on basic civics and sort of basic ideas of what we owe to one another, the American people, that basis has not eroded. And I've actually been watching, I think, basically since the Trump administration, wondering if things like the president saying it's smart not to pay your taxes was going to cause finally a fracture in this shared agreement, and it hasn't. So I think there's a place to come from with this.
Hi. I just you made one statement about during the Second World War, which to the effect that FDR was considering a sales tax. So my reading of the Morgenthau Diaries, Volume 2, The War Years, is that Secretary Morgenthau went to FDR and said, "Can we present a proposal for a personal consumption tax?" And FDR said, "Yes, but you can't go. You have to send your staff." So Roy Blau and I'm forgetting this person that I personally knew, went up and testified to Senate Finance. Senate Finance was not interested. They wanted to shift to a mass tax, but also forgive a year's worth of tax because they were going to go to withholding. And they would have, oh dear, the rich would have to pay estimated taxes for last year, or final settlements for last year and withholding for this year, dear. So we got to forgive that past tax due. In the meantime, the Ways and Means Committee wanted to pass a sales tax, which they had done previously in the 20s. Anyway, it's just, it's not a big point, but I'm not sure FDR thought a whole lot about taxes, to be honest.
Well, yeah, so it's really interesting, and it's wonderful that someone else has read the Morgenthau Diaries. It makes me feel like I'm not alone in the world.
You feel seen.
Yeah, I do. I feel seen.
There you go.
Yeah, so FDR was not a great student of economics, generally speaking. There's a very funny incident where he meets John Maynard Keynes, and FDR comes away saying that I didn't know economics was so much math. And Keynes said, I had no idea that because obviously a lot of what FDR is doing runs on Keynesian principles, right? We're going to invest and we're going to help restart the economy and all this, and they didn't get along at all. So it's true, he absolutely was not in the weeds on taxes, but he was quite certain that he wanted an income tax over a sales tax, both because he thought it was fairer, and obviously he's coming sort of from out of that progressive tradition, and also there was a fair amount of tension as some states had put in place sales taxes, and so you were kind of stepping on a few toes there as well. But it's completely the case that, for example, when the question of Social Security had been put on the table, that some people talked, the most effective thing was, we'll pay for Social Security with some kind of version of a sales tax. And FDR was terribly opposed. He very much wanted Social Security to be paid with payroll taxes so that people were chipping in, so that they were contributors, right? And he really understood that the power of that civic sense, that as a taxpayer you're doing your part, and that he thought that and I think largely correctly, he thought that by setting up the tax system for Social Security in a way where you paid and then you got benefits, it would protect his program against cuts. And I think that was largely true. So yeah, I think that FDR's understanding of economics was pretty limited, but his understanding of tax politics was basically second to none. Yeah.
Love it.
So I'm kind of slogging my way through the book. I've become Kindle dependent over the years, and I'm reading this one in hard copy, and it's hard going back to that, but it's great. I haven't gotten to the World War II part, and I was struck when you all were talking about it, how folks were more than willing to pay their tax when the income tax was first introduced. And I haven't been paying income tax since World War II, but I have been paying income tax since maybe the early 70s. And what I can remember from back then is seeing the bracket schedule from then, where you had like 25 different brackets, and the levels just kept going up and up and up, and now we have 7 of them, and they kind of stop at a relatively low level of income and a low marginal rate. And I think that when I saw those brackets back then, without really thinking about it, I could kind of feel the fairness and the progressivity. And you know, of course, it was done in the name of making it simple, which really there's not much simplicity in cutting down the number of brackets. They could do a lot better if they did something about subchapter K. But I wonder what you thought about that, whether that change has something to do with it.
So I think there are 2 things there that are both really interesting, and I'd love your thoughts as well on this. One, the question of whether people have less understanding of how the tax system works because they aren't doing the math anymore, or even seeing the tables. I think it's incredibly rare, for people to actually still use the tables and work out the math for themselves. And so I think that, for one, I think there's kind of there's some understanding that's being lost just in general, never mind what the brackets actually are or how they've changed. On the question of the brackets, I want to tell. First of all, it's worth pointing out, right? So if you were paying taxes in the 70s, you were looking at a 70% rate, right? A far higher rate than we pay today. And in the World War II era, the top marginal rate was in the 90s. So we're talking about very high marginal rates. I'm going to tell you a story just because I like telling the story about the first sort of American bracket tax plan, which was written by Tom Paine. Some of you will remember his name. He wrote Common Sense, so he wrote the pamphlet that at the start of the Revolution, argued not only that America should be an independent country, that is to say not a colony of Britain, but it also argued that America should be a republic, that we did not need to have a king. And this pamphlet, Common Sense, was the most widely read, most popular document in the early American period by far. So Tom Paine wrote Common Sense. He also wrote a book called The Rights of Man. And this was a defense of the French Revolution. Tom Paine was a revolutionary in 3 countries over his life, lived a good life. And The Rights of Man is mostly famous for the part about the French Revolution. But in it, Tom Paine lays out a bracket-based income tax system, which at the time was like totally new. No one had the concepts of brackets yet. Marginality was only like barely understood conceptually. And so he proposes a tax on the income from wealth. And he's aiming this at Britain primarily, because in America, there simply wasn't the level of wealth there was in Britain. Like, among free people, the range of economic inequality was quite small. It was what Benjamin Franklin called a happy mediocrity of our economic condition. They felt that was really very important for having a republic in the first place. But Tom Paine is thinking about Britain, and he's worried that the overgrown influence of wealth is going to be corrupting at elections. Right? And so he's very worried that the consolidation of wealth will damage the capacity of a country to have free and fair elections. And so he writes this tax plan, and he writes out all in shillings and pounds how it's all going to work. And it starts from quite a low rate and a relatively low income, and it goes to something like £23,000, I think was the top bracket, with a rate of 100%. Tom Paine believed that there needed to be a limit to property in order to protect the capacity of a republic to hold fair elections. Now, what was £23,000? You're asking. Obviously, would it have affected me? If you take the dollars that Paine used in The Rights of Man and update them to contemporary dollars, it comes in at about $1 billion. That's about the level of wealth that would produce that level of income. And so I think that
I'm willing to accept that limit for me.
Yeah, that's okay, right?
I'm good with that.
I could work under that number. I'd still get by. So I think it's really interesting to think about. We have so many debates about the progressivity of the income tax and what that top rate is, and it's really nowhere near the rate we've had in the past or the rates Americans have been talking about since our founding. There's a long-winded answer to a question about tax brackets, but I genuinely do think that the idea that high brackets at the top are what's fair is what Americans believe and what Americans have believed from the beginning.
Hi, thank you for this panel. Obviously income inequality is soaring, I haven't read the book yet, and I will, but does it address at all the estate tax or the possibility of a wealth tax?
Yeah, I talk about it a little bit. Mostly I talk about it's worth knowing the history of why a wealth tax might be deemed unconstitutional today, right? And so I tell that story in the book. When I said before that every tax limitation in our federal constitution was intended to defend slavery, one of those limitations was in the 3/5 clause. You'll all maybe remember. Southern states wanted extra representation to defend slavery, and they achieved that by counting 3/5 of enslaved people for the purposes of representation. In that clause, the other thing that needs to be apportioned, according to that formula, is direct taxes. And there's a very funny moment if you read Madison's notes on the constitutional, the convention where they're writing the Constitution. Someone raises their hand at one point and says, asks for a definition of what a direct tax is. And in Madison's notes we find no one answered, right? So there's this. So there's this idea that direct taxes are also going to be apportioned according to this formula. Eventually, of course, we get rid of the 3/5 part, but the formula, the idea that direct taxes need to be apportioned by state remains in our Constitution. And what that does is it means that it's very hard to tax anything that falls mostly in one state or another, because the amount a state owes is based on the number of people in that state. It doesn't make a ton of sense, and they obviously didn't really think it through at the time, but the reason that it exists is because what they wanted to prevent was taxing one particular kind of wealth that existed predominantly in a few states, and that was enslaved people, right? They wanted to make sure that you couldn't put a heavy tax only on slaves because, and thereby achieve abolition, because states that didn't have any slaves would still somehow be responsible for paying this tax. It's genuinely quite nonsensical. There are a few real oddities in our Constitution, but this is maybe the weirdest one. Anyway, so the direct tax clause was taken to mean a direct tax on people or a direct tax on land. That was how it was understood for the first 100 years. And that's why we could have an income tax in the Civil War, because no one saw an income tax as falling under this direct tax clause. But the direct tax clause was just sitting there in the Constitution, largely unnoticed, but ready and waiting for when the Supreme Court wanted to prevent an income tax, right? We have a much more conservative Supreme Court at the end of the 19th century. This is when you get things like Plessy v. Ferguson and a bunch of limitations on like rules against child labor and all these other sort of very conservative decisions. One of the decisions during that period decides that the income tax is now unconstitutional because the income tax is now, for the first time, despite the fact that we had literally used it in the Civil War, that it is now a direct tax. And so that's the reason why we end up having to have this income tax amendment, right? And so it is sort of widely accepted that the same, and I would argue, fundamentally deeply flawed rationale is what would be the pretext for making a wealth tax, declaring a wealth tax unconstitutional today. So this is when there are proposals to think about how to do wealth taxation, how to use our tax code to address as you said, absolutely extraordinary income inequality that we exist with today. Part of the challenge is overcoming the roadblocks that were put in place by the slaveholders at the very origins of our country. And that protection for their aristocratic wealth worked for them, and it appears that it is likely, at least under the contemporary Supreme Court, to continue to work going forward. Yeah.
There were other questions, yeah.
Hi. The interpretation of the Boston Tea Party, the cause of it, I think is fascinating. I've seen that in previous work by Slemrod, for example. He's written about that. What I find interesting about it is, like, you could, from a historical narrative perspective, you could emphasize, say, like the Stamp Act and the Townshend Act, and I think that's what a lot of discussions emphasize, and not the Tea Act. So I was curious, like, when and how did the interpretation of history evolve to sort of emphasize the tax hikes rather than like the Tea, like the proximate cause? I guess the Tea Act right at the end.
That's a really great question. So we call the Boston Tea Party the Boston Tea Party, and by the way, I should say, like my interpretation, as you put it, of the what provoked the Boston Tea Party is universally agreed to by historians. There's nothing novel about that. It's just not well known in the public, which is really startling. It says something about the quality of the sort of historical information that we were receiving in our regular lives.
I didn't know it.
Right.
Yeah.
And yeah, it's just not well known, despite the fact that any story of the Boston Tea Party would tell you this. So the Boston Tea Party was originally not called the Boston Tea Party, which is a really cute name. It makes it seem like a really fun little event. It was originally called the Destruction of the Tea, and because at the time people absolutely understood that it was very radical, right? This is property destruction. This is attacking like a massive corporation. This is going up against the most powerful empire the world had ever known. So the destruction of the tea was not universally beloved by the people we now see sort of are the founders, right? George Washington thought it was a bad idea. John Adams loved it. He thought it was tremendous. But Benjamin Franklin wasn't sure about it either. So it was a deeply controversial event. And for decades thereafter, we didn't know, and we still don't know today, exactly who participated. Because obviously, if you go and throw 90,000 pounds of tea, worth millions of dollars into the harbor, you are at risk of prosecution, right? And so it was only, and this is really interesting, it was only as the last of the revolutionary generation was dying, so perhaps in the way that we might think of the greatest generation today, and they were sort of that the events were far enough behind us that their radicalism was no longer frightening, and they could create sort of a happy, sort of a safe story of even the most radical parts of the revolution. That you begin to see it, one, called the Boston Tea Party, and two, even much discussed. It had been very much seen as sort of an event so radical that we don't really tell that story very often. And so the people who participated, who lived their lives in anonymity, first, obviously, to protect them from prosecution, and then later, simply because the event wasn't very well remembered. At the very end of their lives, they sort of become local celebrities. These, very elderly mechanics and artisans who had participated, and you have these stories of their recollections. And there's a very sweet one. A guy named George Robert Twelves Hughes. He was a shoemaker, and he was one of the men on the boats who threw the tea overboard. And he tells his stories in like the 1830s, and he remembers. He remembers two things. One, he remembers someone tried to steal some of the tea, and he stopped them, because this was not thievery, right? This was rebellion. And it was, so, if you may recall from the story, that they go out afterwards and make sure all the tea has sunk, because they don't want to profit, and they don't want anyone else to profit. The point here is to stand up to the empire, right? And not to like tuck a bag of tea in your pocket and sell it later. And so he tells the story of how they prevented that kind of looting. And then he also tells a story of, and it probably wasn't true, but he believed it, that one of the people on the boats was John Hancock. And so for him, it was this moment that brought everyone, like the fanciest, most wealthy people of Boston, and little guys like him, into the same activity, that we were doing it all together. And he remembered that at one point, the costume that one of them had been wearing had gone up, and that he had seen someone's lace cuffs, and that was evidence that they were one of the rich men who were, even they too were participating. Anyway, it's an amazing history, and I think it's one really worth knowing the real story, because of, people like that, again, they deserve to, they're part of our history, they're an important part of our history, and their stories deserve to be told. So yeah, I think it is the right question to ask why it is that often genuinely just factually wrong stories of our history are what we remember. And I think it's worth thinking about why it is that history has become so controversial now. Right, that so much of the story, the American story, is stuff that we can't agree to talk about in schools. And to me, knowing the whole story, first of all, I just think that we need to treat people respectfully, that they can handle the truth, right? And that's true for all Americans. But I think it's also, it's an indication that if we knew the true story, we might imagine we could make the world better in certain ways. Right? That we might imagine that our history is more inspiring, and that there's this drive towards equality, this drive towards building a government that helps people. And to the extent we lose that history, it becomes harder for us to imagine that we can do that work today. So yeah, no, I think you're exactly right that we should be asking ourselves why we don't know more of these stories.
In the back?
Yeah, I have a question. I have not had the opportunity to read the book yet, but I was ever curious, I'm a D.C. resident, to know if there are proposals to waive the federal tax for D.C. residents since they don't have the right to vote.
All right, I'm going to tell you some fun stories. It's not specifically about DC, but throughout American history, people have made this point that that I am not represented, then I should not have to pay taxes. And one early group of people who made that case was a guy who was actually became a very wealthy shipbuilder in Massachusetts. And he was a man who was, his mom, I believe, was black and his dad was Native American, or it might be the other way around. But anyway, he was excluded in Massachusetts from voting on the basis of his race, despite the fact that the Massachusetts Constitution says no such thing, but he was not allowed to vote locally. And so he, Cuffy was his name, and he went on tax strike precisely because he had been excluded from his right to vote. And he writes this letter, which you can see actually, it's in the African American Museum, so you can actually see it. You guys here in person are lucky enough you can actually come see this letter personally. He writes this letter about how he had fought in the Revolutionary War, along with many other black Americans, a war that was fought in large part because we believed that the people who had the power to tax Americans were the state legislatures, because that's where we had representation. We didn't have representation in Parliament. We were not, so they did not have the right to tax us. And so that argument that without representation, taxation is fundamentally unfair and you shouldn't have to do it, was something that free black people used commonly in making the case that they should receive representation as taxpayers. And he was a very big taxpayer because he was a very successful businessman. So yeah, that has definitely long been a part of our history, and it's actually something that the idea that the idea has almost been inverted in more recent years, right? So back then, the idea was that I have paid taxes and therefore deserve to be represented. Now, or at least in relatively recent years, there's this sort of the rhetoric of the 47%, which I also talk about in the book. And it's almost the inverse, because so the 47% statistic, for those who do not remember it, is something that Mitt Romney said most famously, I think, but it was sort of it had wide currency during the Obama administration, that a substantial fraction of the public weren't taxpayers. And the statistic itself comes from the fraction of households that pay net federal income taxes. Of course, even if you don't end up owing net federal income taxes, you owe payroll taxes and sales taxes and gas taxes and all the other taxes people pay. So everyone is a taxpayer. But this statistic gained currency that just this very large fraction of the public are not taxpayers. And what struck me both at the time and until today is that the argument was never that we should expand the income tax. No one ever made that case when they were complaining about the 47%. The point was always to say that the imagined 47% did not deserve representation, right? That there were a class of Americans who did not deserve benefits and they did not deserve power because they were not taxpayers. And so I think it's really interesting to see how that same kind of rhetoric has been inverted to try and undermine the citizenship rights of such a broad swath of the public, right? Nearly half of the public. And I think in some ways it should have been an indicator to us of the direction that we were going, right? That more and more people would be seen as undeserving of participation.
Yeah, just one reflection on the book. If you think about, you can look at American history through a lot of different lenses. If you look at the history of America through the lens of a battle or a tension between equity and inequity, it's a really interesting way to look at U.S. history. I think what you do in this book is you take us on a tour of U.S. history through the battle of equity and inequity in the tax system. And it's like a nice reflection of that tour you can take of U.S. history. And so, for me, it was kind of a very valuable, enlightening, because I kept on drawing connections between the battles and this tension between equity and inequity and other forms of American life or other dimensions, whether it be, the justice system and other things. So, yeah.
This kind of further what you just discussed Now, I think I've made this remark to you already, Vanessa, but what struck me, what's fascinating, is these tropes that are being trotted out today by the anti-taxers reappear throughout history. And the passage I just read yesterday was fascinating. I want you to comment further on it if you can. Is what's being invoked now, mostly in opposition to state taxes, is that rich people will move if they have to pay tax, and I read about it in an 1894 context, and I thought that was absolutely fascinating.
Oh dear. Yes, the myth of wealthy tax flight is in no sense new. Yes, that's absolutely right. And so yes, when the income tax was first, there was some possibility of the income tax passing. So it's again, so this is a state-by-state battle to amend the Constitution. The barrier to getting that done is, of course, very, very high. You need 3/4 of the states. And that is, by the way, the reason that Congress passed the income tax amendment at all, is because they were confident it would die in the states. They were like, there's no way we can pass this amendment text and it'll die in the states and we can look like we care, and we don't. But anyway, but they were wrong because the income tax was vastly more popular than they had really understood. And so you see the income tax pass all through the West, as we already discussed. It makes its way through the South. It's a little bit of a stumble because southern states there's that anti-tax sort of tradition that stems from slavery and continues in the Jim Crow era. And really, it gets through to some degree because most of the people who are going to pay the tax and live in the Northeast, and taxing the Yankees, oh, well, okay, I suppose we can manage that. And so they managed to pass most states in the South. But if there's a bastion that's going to prevent us having a federal income tax, it's the Northeast, right? And this is where the very wealthy people of the sort of industrial era lived. And these are the folks who were planning to move away if this terrible tax passed. And we're constantly telling the newspapers about that, how they would flee the country. And so one of the most ardent opponents of the income tax was, you may have heard from J.D. Rockefeller. It rings a bell, right? He was then the richest man on earth, and I don't know that this is actually true anymore, but until recently he was, if you updated the numbers, he was still the richest man who had ever lived. That may finally have been superseded recently. But J.D. Rockefeller hated the income tax so profoundly. It was his lawyers who had argued against the income tax in 1895 when the Supreme Court decided it was unconstitutional, so they'd been successful there. And he ends up getting his lawyers he's going to win in Albany, right? He's going to win in New York, the wealthiest of the wealthy states, right? And so he gets his lawyers to write this memo to every legislator in Albany about how the horrors of the income tax and how obviously it's going to drive away the job creators. He doesn't say job creators, that's new, but that kind of language, and it raises a bunch of other sort of similar rhetoric that you'd recognize today. Among them that with the power of an income tax, then all these sort of fads like canals and roads are going to be funded by people who simply can't be trusted, and that's where the memo ends up. He ends up saying that high marginal taxation is the most fundamental threat posed by democracy, right? Because to his mind, the idea that he might have to pay a little more in taxes was reason enough to doubt the capacity of the American people to tax fairly and for good purposes, right? So yeah, so absolutely, there's very little that's new in anti-tax rhetoric. There was a huge leap forward when we went from calling it leveling to calling it communism. But other than that, there has not been a lot of moves in terms of the rhetoric of opposition to progressive taxation over the years, for sure.
Yeah. One kind of simplistic way of thinking about how we've evolved to where we are in this moment is, and just thinking about the Boston Tea Party and then the Tea Party movement during the Obama years, was you have a political faction in America that feels like we're overtaxing as a nation, but also is really, really worried about the debt and the deficit and the fiscal solvency of the U.S. These two things are really important. And so just doing basic algebra, the only thing you're left with is spend and government spend.
Yeah.
And if you're anti-tax and really, really concerned about the debt and deficit, you only have one lever you can pull.
Right.
And so you start really kind of getting into this idea of waste and fraud and error, and government is too big. And that's, I think, part of the, and that you can then take a step back and say, are we really optimizing the right outcome by putting all of our concentration into this area of reduced spend? And that's kind of one of the risks, I think, of an anti-tax movement, is then you can end up underspending on things that could compromise air safety, in the skies, or food illness, or whatever some of the basic government services are.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's exactly right. I mean, and it's a shift you see, and I outline later in the book how the Republican Party goes from a party that, was willing to vote for some tax increases, was, concerned about spending, to a party that was uniformly anti-tax, and how that switch and sort of the continuation of that path was sort of, what was anti-tax, fundamentally anti-government, and then became anti-democratic fundamentally, right? And that transition, that ratchet, was something that was in intentional policy, right? There were Republican strategists who talked about the value of blowing up the deficit when you were in office with either tax cuts or military spending, and then leaving it for the next guy to figure out, right? That you could kick the can down the road, and it would create this ratchet that would put downward pressure on spending. And I think it's a good lesson for the future, because when we're thinking about what it will mean to rebuild our government, if you think about rebuilding NIH or CDC or any of these institutions that have provided so much benefit to the American people over the years, you can't have that conversation in any serious way without addressing the need for more revenue, right? And to me, this is a place where the Democrats have really, they haven't quite arrived at a story that's actually going to solve a problem, right? Because there's a reasonable amount of the Democratic Party that's willing to talk about some amount of tax increases on wealthy people. You don't really hear mid-20th century rates discussed very often, but some amount of increasing taxes on the very wealthy. But what you don't hear, and this goes back to the rhetoric that's been lost from earlier generations, what you don't hear is the rhetoric of an FDR or Lyndon Baines Johnson about, we're all going to pay in so that we can have good stuff, right? And then, we're going to talk about tax increases that apply to most people, because at the end of the day, you're going to get then Social Security or Medicare, and you could imagine in the future it could be something like universal child care. But there's something that we all chip into, because it's our government, and we're going to do this great, we're going to achieve something really great with it, right? And to me, the time I will finally feel optimistic, and those of you who know me will know that you've never met me during an optimistic time, but I will finally feel optimistic when someone in our politics is willing to make that case. Not just that, sort of democracy in sort of general terms, like a bald eagle flying overhead or something, but the idea that our government is so valuable that I'm going to tell you why you should pay for it, right?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of cognitive dissonance in the world today in the space of government and tax. For example, I think you raised earlier this, if President Trump says something about paying tax, you don't have to pay your taxes anymore. I forget the exact quote, but in the next breath, he's celebrating the tax cuts. Why do the tax cuts matter if there's going to be no enforcement, right? Yeah. They matter because we still have these truisms that we do have tax laws, and they are really important to follow, and most Americans and companies will follow them. Yeah. When I was at the IRS, we talked a lot about going after tax cheats, and it seems like there may be more tax cheats, but the reality is the vast majority of Americans want to play by the rules and do play by the rules. But I've always felt that I get this question all the time. It's like, are you worried about voluntary compliance in our tax system with all this rhetoric about a hollowed out IRS? And then the next question is it fair that the OB3 bill cut all these taxes for the rich? And it's like, those two things are like, you can see them in an inconsistent way, but I see them as part of an important discussion we have to have, where we have to rethink about the role of the IRS and tax administration going forward. Are we, one more question? Oh, 1 more minute. Okay, with 1 more minute, I have a closing I want to make, which is, first of all, if I was to, I made the point earlier about the looking at American history as a tension of equity and inequity. and how you've done that through the reflection of tax policy, which was really, really valuable. I think as you get ready to read the book, or if you've read the book, I would say the most powerful section for me, even though I love the IRS stuff, was the discussion of Reconstruction. And I think that's where the visceralness of equity and equity plays out, and seeing the reflection of how the taxes were discussed and debated in that moment, for me was really powerful. And the reason why I want to end on this is I was talking to someone recently who was commenting to me that when you're on Constitution Avenue in DC and you're driving down, you drive by the IRS and then the Justice Department is next. And he says, if you look at those two buildings, the Justice Department has all these quotes etched in the stone about justice, all these different variation of quotes. You can spend a lot of time reading all the quotes standing out there on Constitution Avenue. The IRS only has one. And the one is from Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, taxes are what we pay for a civilized society. And there's a power in that only one. But I think if we were to ever add a second, I think it's a quote that you brought out in the Reconstruction section, so I wrote it down. And the quote it goes as follows: "Not as slaves, but as free men, money we will give." And I thought that was like a real, like I said, if I ever were to endorse putting a second quote on the IRS building, that would be it. And for me, it's kind of another inspiring point, not just about taxes as required to have infrastructure and plumbing and all these things, but also this idea as we gain democracy and freedom, that we want to invest in this American experiment. And I think that's another valuable dimension of taxes. So that's my pitch for one more quote at 1111 Constitution Avenue. But thank you for writing this book. I am going to recommend it as required reading, not just for people that are entering careers in tax or have careers in tax or care, but required reading to really understand the moment that we're in right now, the inflection point that the U.S. government and the world really is in right now, and how do we move forward. So thank you for this wonderful book.
Well, thank you, Danny. Thank you, everyone, for coming. I appreciate it. Thank you.